Today we're here with Jeremy Stone. I'm Mick Barnes of Barnes Partners on behalf of the board of Globo Hydropower Limited. I'll leave it to you, Jeremy, to describe your various roles and associations and boards you're involved with the key topic today about hydrogen. So we're here to talk about hydrogen.
All right, thanks, Mick. So for me, my qualifications are engineering. I'm a professional engineer with also qualifications in business administration. But really over my career, I've had three focus areas. One is innovation, second being transformation, and the third being creativity. And creativity not so much in the artistic creativity, but more around creation of infrastructure, creation of technologies and new industries. So right now, I have a company called Vaish, so that's as in innovation. My kids used to call me Vaish. So with there I do advisory and investment, looking at right now an organisation which is topical with the coronavirus. They've got technology which purifies air and sterilises surfaces using hydroxyl radicals.
Okay.
So that's pretty interesting. I have a business with my wife called Creative Cities 21, which re-energises people with these 5-day creative escapes in New York City. And I also have a number of directorship roles, one of which is with J-Power, a Japanese utility company. For the Australian viewers, they're about 2.5 times the size of AGL in terms of generation capacity, about 50% fossil fuel and 50% renewable. And of course, their aim for a cleaner world is to put more effort into cleaner fuels, and hydrogen is one of their big focuses. And we're part of a consortium involved in a very major $500 million hydrogen project in Victoria. And to get that hydrogen industry off the ground, to tie back to my three interest areas, it's going to need innovation, transformation, and creativity.
I mean, hydrogen as a fuel's been used and around for 50 years. There's quite a lot of roadblocks and obstacles in the way where you talk to people and they'll just say, we need to have more renewables. Why aren't we? You know, what's stopping? It makes sense, something like hydrogen is a clean fuel. Sort of scratching their heads going, well, why aren't we doing more with renewables and in particular hydrogen? Anything in your various roles and capacities and with J-Power, anything that you can sort of shed a light on there and what you think are the major obstacles?
Well, first of all, taking a more larger view of where we're going and why we need hydrogen, I think reducing greenhouse gas is our driver. You know, we've got to reduce the atmospheric CO2. So hydrogen, when it burns, it only releases water. So the question is, how do we produce hydrogen? And the renewables comes up in there as well, because you can produce hydrogen through renewable energy, through electrolysis, which splits water into H2, hydrogen, and O2 gets released. And there are other ways of generating hydrogen through coal gasification with carbon capture and storage, as well as steam methane reforming with carbon capture and storage. But the challenge we have to reach zero carbon emissions by net zero carbon emissions by 2050, or whatever the target is, there is no silver bullet. So we need quite an array of options on the table to reach those targets. And hydrogen is one of those options. And what it does have is great ability to store energy. It's 2.5 times the storage of energy than LNG, for example. And even in the UK Committee on Climate Change, when their target is zero emissions by 2050, they don't just have one requirement, which is 4 times the capacity in their renewable energy system. They've got 9 in total, which includes hydrogen, 14 times the ramp up of hydrogen. They've got carbon capture and storage from 0 to 180 million tonnes per year. And 180 million tonnes per year by interest is about 1/3 of Australia's emissions per year. So the scale of this is immense. And I think what we actually need is to have a range of options on the table. Let's take nothing off, there's no silver bullet, and let's go for it. And back human endeavour, back the scientists and the engineers and others to work.
Yes.
We like to overcome challenges and problems, and I think we can do it.
Yeah, and look, I mean, you think about it, something like hydrogen, it powers the sun itself, and it's the most abundant element in the universe.
Yeah, we just can't mine it. We
Yeah.
can't dig it up.
And
We have to create
yes.
it. Yeah.
Then there's storage requirements then, and because you can imagine storing vast amounts of hydrogen as either a gas or a liquid, there's obviously complications with that.
There are complications, there are challenges, but it can be done. The need is so great, we have to go through them. So, the great thing about hydrogen, apart from being a very clean fuel when it burns, it's very flexible. It can be transported. It can be used in vehicles. It can be used in industry. It can be used as feedstock for chemical production. So it's got a tremendous amount of use. It can be injected into our gas pipelines up to 10% without any. It's being validated, but it appears there'll be no negative impact on our gas pipelines. So there's lots of ways we can introduce it, but it needs regulations will need to change. We need to ensure that it's safe. Although it's been around and used for 50 years with a very good safety record, the public needs to be comfortable with it.
Yeah.
And I think that's so. There's a bit of an education program to allow the public to catch up to what this might be, and they need to feel comfortable with it. But the advantages are immense, and which is why there's about 20 countries just of late who have now got hydrogen strategies. They're now moving towards hydrogen. So I think timing is everything in business, as you would know from your business, but also with innovation. You can have the greatest technology, but you just miss the timing. I think the timing is so great, and given today's world, it's I think economically challenging for the foreseeable future. This may be a way to bring the world together in actual fact and come together and build a brand new global industry. That would be my wish out of the pain we're suffering with the coronavirus outbreak.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think from a philosophical point of view, this sounds like a scene from the Armageddon movie. Look, life will go on. We will come through this, and I think a lot of things will change, a lot of people's attitudes, the way we do business. I can already sense it changing, and when we get through this, I think we'll have our eyes a little bit more open to, as a society, I'm saying, and looking for alternatives. And I think one of the biggest things you touched on before was with hydrogen in the industry is safety. Majority of people might think of hydrogen bombs when you say the word hydrogen. If it's applied at a retail level in cars, there's probably been this misconception of I'm driving around in a hydrogen bomb, but not really understanding. There's some complex science to actually make a hydrogen bomb isn't.
Well, that's not our industry, but
no, it's a very complex thing to do.
But I think, as you mentioned before, hydrogen's been used, for decades in industry. There's about 70 million tonnes per year which is produced, mainly for making ammonia, which goes into fertiliser and those sorts of things. So the history, the safety record is strong, and as a society, we do operate with what you could call dangerous materials. So, petrol in our car, it can be explosive, but we find a way to manage those risks, and with technology and safety features, and I think people become comfortable with what it is, and I think people can live their life knowing that a lot of effort has gone in to make the society safe. But again, I just go back to where we're heading. We're on the ground floor really of a massive industry here, and I think the numbers sometimes
especially in Australia.
But just on a global concept. So the Hydrogen Council, their target is that hydrogen will be 18% of the energy mix in the world. So 18% sounds like a low number, but 18% by 2050. Of which that will then abate CO2 by 20%, so about 6.2 gigatons.
Because those numbers pretty much correlate, don't they?
Yeah, so it's large. It will be about 30 million people employed in that industry. But from the Australian context, So a report was commissioned to say what would the hydrogen economy maybe look like in 2050. So they're talking about 7,000 to 8,000 employees in that industry, dedicated employees, with about $11 billion business. Now that sounds like a large number, but when you now compare it with mature industries,
that's right.
or even a fairly immature industry like natural gas. Natural gas has really only been around since the late 70s, at least in Australia. We're now the largest producer. Our income annually is around about $50 billion a year. So $50 billion a year from LNG, which has been around for 40 years. So I think the question we've got to say is how can we get hydrogen up to that level from the Australian context, so it becomes a great exporter and not just something we can use in Australia, hydrogen, but how can we export and try and get up to the same levels as coal or LNG?
Yeah, and I think one of the strategies or we've been sort of looking at is getting the uptake, and that's been a bit of a problem. There's always resistance in a market where we're using hybrids to say, look, it's going to be a mixture, so you can still use your combustion engines that are already in existence, so it's not a big overhaul for you where we're fully changing your whole way you operate and do your business, because we know that can scare people in business. No, you keep doing what you're doing, you just apply this, you keep running your normal fuel system. We change the fuel content, so we change the mixture, so using a portion hydrogen, a portion your diesel, for example. And it seems to get a bit of a better response than knocking on a door saying, no, forget everything you're doing and everything you know. We've got this renewable energy, and we know you want renewable energy.
Yeah.
We're just going to implement this from day one. It's going to change your world. In business, it doesn't quite work that easily. Unfortunately, people need to see results. So we're trying hybrid systems to get people to slowly get used to it and accept it, and we'll try and then.
But every bit you do, I think doing something, you'll learn and you move on. I think change is difficult for most people, and I think change is difficult and can be expensive potentially for businesses. But I think the cost of doing nothing, I think, is going to be more significant. So, I mean, I would advocate let's get going, and doing anything positive is a good thing.
Yep.
There is no silver bullet, and setting targets. It's like your chicken and the egg thing. We have a chicken and the egg situation. We can produce it at scale, but can we consume it at scale?
Yeah.
And so we've somehow got to try and keep these running together. I mean, who would have thought the renewable uptake over the last 5 or 6 years has been incredible? So, I mean, we can do it, and that change was difficult to start with, but I think people are now very comfortable with it. They can see the advantages. The cost has come down considerably. I see the same in hydrogen, and we saw the same in LNG. Within 40 years in Australia, no industry to the world's leading exporter.
Yep.
So we can use that experience in Australia, taking the Australian context, we can use that experience about transformation and apply that to the hydrogen sector. We've got those skills which can be transferable, and I think we've got the confidence to do it. But it's not one big splash.
No.
It's we talk about we're here and we want to be up here. It's really about how do we transition, and that's where a lot of the debate becomes: is it just renewables or is it just this? Well, I think we need to keep everything on the table here. Yep. Everything on the table, and keep doing all the bits we can do, learn from it, move on, learn from it and move on. And that's been my experience with other innovation or commercialisation. I think the cost of doing nothing is too great.
Yeah, spot on. I think you mentioned previously about other renewables, especially like with electrolysis. Like you can collaborate. So don't need to be too competitive in this space, so other renewables trying to outcompete, saying no, ours is a superior product, so solar's more superior to hydrogen. You can actually find in most cases, or a lot of cases, a collaborative effort where you can have multiple renewables working together.
The energy system's complex, and we're driving for change as quickly as we can. And again, hydrogen is just one of the alternatives which we can use for our energy mix. I think the situation with collaboration, just going back to your point, I think Collaboration is really important. I think this can be a global collaboration. There will always be competition,
Yep.
and competition can be healthy. From the Australian context with exports, and I think we can go into a state by state or a technology by technology competition, but in actual fact, to get the exports, our competition are actually other nations.
Yep.
So whether it be Russia, whether it be Brunei, the Middle East, Norway, who want to export their hydrogen to the places like Japan and South Korea and Singapore and into Europe, our competition, our opportunities to get into those markets with clean hydrogen as fast as we can with a reliable and safe supply chain. So we can sometimes have a sense of scarcity and want to compete all the time. I think if you take the Australian context, we've got to find a way of coming together and we can learn off each other and share.
Yep.
But for exports, it's going to be competing against other nations. And in terms of what's the best way to produce hydrogen, there are multiple methods, as I mentioned. At the moment, keep them all on the table because we need to get moving quickly.
Yep.
And they all have their advantages and perhaps some disadvantages, but let's get going. And I think ultimately the challenge is going to be the supply chain and the opportunities for investors or people looking for new business models, as you were going before. We've got a whole supply chain to build up here, everything. So even vehicles. I mean, vehicles is an interesting thing. So at the moment, there's about 11,000 fuel cell electric vehicles on the road. And they want to get that up to about 35 million by 2030. Now, if you think about that number, you think, well, how do they ramp up the production of these vehicles? There's the Toyota, there's the Hyundai have vehicles, trucks, there's Nikola trucks in the US. And there's buses, there's trams, there's trains.
Sydney use them.
Yeah. So how do we get that rolling stock up? How do we produce them? Is that an opportunity again for Australians to somehow find a way? How can they fit into that global supply chain, or do we simply wait for these vehicles to turn up? I don't have the answer. What about learning, training, skill development, the infrastructure to transport it, the infrastructure to store it? As you mentioned before, there's multiple ways. These are all opportunities going forward, and so I think this is the great opportunity for all the states and territories of Australia to come together on this sort of platform going forward.
Do you get exposed to any sort of mining companies that say, well, can we work with you on, we're developing something new? Yes, our core product is getting a fossil fuel out of the ground or whatever, but we want to use that for renewables. Is there a way to implement this into the hydrogen space? Do you come across any of that?
Not in that context. I think the conversation should really it's not anti-mining, it's about reducing CO2, atmospheric CO2.
Yeah.
So I think there's anti-movements all over the place, but it's actually our target is to reduce CO2, atmospheric CO2. Carbon, just on a side matter, can be used and is used in industry. So CO2 right now is used in industry, in food and beverage, in agriculture, building materials. You can carbonate minerals and use that into. So it's used.
Soft drinks.
The carbonated soft drinks. Well done. So I think but what we're trying to reduce is the atmospheric CO2.
Yes. Yep.
And we need miners, iron ore and other materials, steel. Produces CO2. How can we change the steel production methodology rather than using coking coal?
Yep.
And can we change? So a lot of work is being done right now on the cement industry to change its techniques to use cement with lower CO2 emissions. Same with the steel industry. What we're doing with our consortium is we are gasifying coal.
Yep.
Okay, to produce hydrogen, and then we capture the carbon and safely store it. Yep. But that's a very different technique than a coal-fired power station. They're different. But if you keep your eye on the CO2 emissions, you'll normally come up with the right answer.
Yeah.
And so I don't subscribe to putting everyone into a bucket. It's a bucket of what are we doing to reduce the CO2 emissions, and you want people to be doing their utmost to achieve that goal.
Yeah. I didn't want to interrupt you before, but with the coal in particular, I've heard because what we do isn't quite the similar. It's a different sort of process, but I've heard and I've spoke to others in the industry, they talk about microwaving as a way of, they don't really elaborate anymore. I think that they really try and protect their IP. But how it was explained to me was it's like a microwaving process to extract the gases out of the coal itself. They can heat it or microwave it at different temperatures to effectively extract certain gases out of the coal. Is that similar to the process you're talking about? Or?
Well, they've kept it so secret, I don't know anything about it. But so our process, so the gasification process, so J-Power's been working on this for 40 years. So it's not just something which just
I'm not asking you about your IP, obviously.
No, but I mean, but it's pretty hot, and that just releases the gases, and through that release, hydrogen comes out, and the CO2 is available. It's available as long as you can capture it and safely bury it. That's the solution. But again, I back human endeavour. If there's an opportunity, people find better and better ways.
That's right.
Less energy intensive, better capture rates, more efficiency, and this is your supply and demand again. How do we get the demand up so much so the supply is significant and the cost per producing starts to come down? Again, this is this. It's an interesting situation, but it's a challenging situation. And I think back to the electric vehicles when they first came out some years ago, how difficult, and it probably still is difficult, how difficult was it years ago to, they had a wonderful electric vehicle, but where do they recharge them? And there were companies who wanted to put recharging stations all over Australia. It's going to cost a fortune, but they didn't have enough vehicles to use them. So the neat thing about hydrogen vehicles are all electric vehicles. You have a battery electric vehicle and you have a fuel cell electric vehicle. So we are heading towards a zero emission vehicles. The question is, how do you refuel? Okay, well, I think that's the challenge. So maybe it's in hubs. So we talk about the Australian hydrogen strategy talks about building up hubs of industry, hydrogen industry producers, nearby with the users. Okay, and I think that concept will slowly get taken up across Australia and across the world in Australia, and therefore there could be only a few refilling stations as we start, and as the demand picks up and as the more vehicles get built, then there'll be the need to have more refueling stations. So just trying to balance supply and demand, very difficult, but possible. And as I said, the Australian strategy talks about hubs as a way to get that going.
I think you're spot on too. Like the cost of it, and that's again a barrier. When we talk to the bigger businesses, and when they've got $1 billion fuel bill, we talk to them about we do trials with them and show them the efficiency. Once you use, it's such an efficient fuel. You can do a trial run with them and then they run the numbers and the analytics and they go, well, hang on, the efficiency that they now get by using this fuel, and they see that and they convert that to real dollars. And they go, well, yeah, this makes sense for us to use that. And that can help. It's more to get that footprint in to say, look, we've got a supply route now where big businesses taking this on. There's a supply channel now using hydrogen, but don't rest on laurels. It's now move forward. How does this now adapt to retail cars and small other applications of using it? Because if you can get one part of the industry entrenched in it, what we're hoping is a domino effect, and then it flows through and it crosses other sectors, and people can see, it does work, and it is safe, and it is relatively cheap, and it's efficient, and we don't have to be scared of it. There's no hydrogen bombs, and it's a very light. There's some pretty cool information out there, and if you look at when they test, which I'm sure you've seen as well. Just hydrogen itself can, it's what's the word? Because it's so light, it doesn't really get absorbed. It sort of it lifts itself out. It's just so environmentally friendly. It's quite a unique element for us to be using, and it just
So where is it on
Yeah.
the table?
Number one.
Yeah.
one proton, one electron. But yeah, it does like to be, it
Number
likes
one.
to join, it likes to be H2.
Yeah.
It's my old chemistry days.
But it's interesting, just on that, I mean, these challenges, there are either opportunities or challenges. So to liquefy hydrogen, so in our supply chain project, for example, we liquefy hydrogen. So that has to be at minus 253 degrees centigrade. That's pretty cold. Okay, and that reduces its volume down to 1/800th. So it can be done. And again, in comparison, I think natural gas to be liquefied is about minus 150. So it's quite a sizable jump, but it can be done. So we can use some of these properties to our advantage also in our vehicles and or in any other uses of it. I think I go back to the supply and demand. I mean, it's a brand new industry. I go back to innovation. I go back to transformation and creativity. Those three elements. It's how do we get it going? I think there's acceptance now that for a clean future, the real drive is about clean future. The real drive is about CO2 reduction. And this is one thing to put on the table to help. And I don't believe at the moment it's necessarily cost competitive, but I believe we're driving towards reducing CO2. But it will be very cost effective if we can get the scale up. So this is about scale up.
That's right.
And that's the opportunity. That's why, you know, I think more and more countries and companies are starting to look at it, because it's more, how do we get scale up here? And we know by scale the price will come down.
That's right.
And everything else benefits. The supply chains benefit, the safety benefits, the skills develop with it. And I think there will always be barriers, there'll be regulatory changes. You go back to social acceptance, so there's a number of pilot plants around Australia now where they're injecting up to 10% of hydrogen into our gas pipelines in small communities, again to get the feedback, to bring it into conversation, to hear what the residents feel about it, and to comfort them that the appliances they use today still work, so there's no cost to them. So this is the gradual change, and the more we talk about hydrogen here, or the more it's in the newspapers, I think in general it's a positive thing, because we actually don't have the time. We've got to get moving really quickly, and so the more people who get involved, who understand it, I think the better.
Yeah, definitely. We need people. We need the corporates who are multidisciplined, people like yourself that understand it's this innovative idea now, and to take some brilliant science to the next level now, and I think we all need it. Society needs this, and that's I love getting involved with these projects, because I think it really is for the greater good, and we can all sort of work together on it and go back to those. We can materialise the vision back in the 1700s of this will be part of the fuel of the future.
Fuel of the future now.
That's
right.
right.
We can do it now.
That's right.
Yeah. So who was that person? So
It's
we'll have to Google a bit later on.
it escapes me.
I recall a quote. It could have been a quote in the hydrogen strategy, but was it Jules Verne who'd
The poet, French,
Yeah,
right?
he spoke
Mystic
about this
journey, Mystic
as
Island.
well. So
yeah,
Anyway, that's related time.
Verne. Yeah,
Jules Verne, I think,
Yeah.
he'd written something about the future energy would be taken away from the fossil fuel of the fossil fuel, just basically burning it into hydrogen. So
I might be confusing the two. It might be Verne who wrote that, who later wrote about it, saying, "Yeah, this will be the fuel."
we'll go and check it later.
Yeah, don't fact check me. We're all over it. We're all around.
Anyway,
Any other final sort of insights into the industry? Any
no.
sense of optimism?
Oh, I've got optimism.
Yep.
I've got optimism, and again, I think timing. Look, I've mentioned it before, but I think timing is crucial. I think the science and engineering is there, or it's certainly come a hell of a long way. I think the interest in it. If you've got nations of the world, 20 at the moment, who've got their strategies, you've got large and small organisations all doing a lot of research and development. Have got their IP. are looking at all elements along the supply chain. That gives me optimism that we've got enough critical mass to get going.
Yep.
The challenge is we need to go quicker, even at that 18% of our energy mix by 2050. Is that enough? And you go back to the LNG of 40 years. Can we ramp that up and squeeze that into 30 years at the same sort of level? And I don't know. I think we'll need a vision, a bold vision. I think we'll need a way of coming together. This may be that industry which brings us together, because it has the element of good at the end, which is reduction of CO2.
Yes. Yep.
Time will tell, but that's what I hope for.
What do you think we need to be doing now, and as industry leaders, and I guess effectively, lack of a better word, lobbyists? I mean, what do you think we should be doing now proactively, especially to get the message out to the public to say, well, let's get on board, let's get an Australian-made this and that, and not just from an Australian point of view, but from a global point of view. What are some proactive measures you think of?
Well, certainly from the Australian context first. So pretty much every state and territory, and now as a nation, we have a global strategy. Yep. Sorry, we have a hydrogen strategy. So all states and territories plus Australia. Yep. So I think the governments has done a wonderful job to date in lifting it up onto the agenda. The chief scientist, Alan Finkel, has done a tremendous job in leading that. I think the other countries are doing the same thing.
Yep.
I see from a production viewpoint, there will be competition. In terms of producing it, is my way of producing it better than someone else's way of producing it? I think there'll be a bit of that tension, which can be harmful if it means we don't do anything. We keep waiting for this perfect solution. Yep. I think there'll be competition, which I think will be healthy, at least in the supply chain for vehicles, or which manufacturer can produce the best vehicle for hydrogen production. I think we need to do a little bit more work in industries like using hydrogen as a feedstock to encourage them to move across into a cleaner hydrogen than what they're using at the moment. So there'll be some work there. But again, a lot of work is being done by some very good organisations in that area. So I'm optimistic. I'm aware it's going to be challenging. I think we have to be pragmatic. I think pragmatism is going to be a really, I think, often used word here. People are looking for this particular one-off silver bullet, but I think we just have to try a range of different approaches to get it moving. And I think, and again, coming together and collaborating to whatever level we can, I think will be really important to move the industry along. Yep. Well, I think the scale of this is massive, and
economies of scale work. That's right. You can't. It's got to get picked up and used.
But I think I hear many people wanting to shut down the coal export industry. Well, coal actually has two elements. There's thermal coal and coking coal. Yep. So coking coal is for steel manufacturing. We need steel, and the thermal coal is for power stations. But we know that's going to drop. Okay, and it should drop. But I worry as an Australian resident is what's going to pick up the slack. So if it's $55 billion a year per year in revenue, how do we quickly replace it? What do we replace it with? And,
that's right.
And it's even the same with LNG. LNG is a fossil fuel. Yeah. It emits CO2. That's $50 billion a year. That's $105 billion a year.
That's right.
Hence my comment about hydrogen. We're talking about $11 billion a year by 2050. Well, now how can we make that 50 billion? I don't have the answer, but how can we make that 50 billion?
And seeing through one of the great examples, rightly or wrongly, it's a Donald Trump, not being political, but he was talking about, when he talks about how things get affected as an industry, when they were talking about some measures, to bring in some measures to cut their emissions, and he brought it back to a basic level of that would wipe out their trucking industry. And then when he brought it back to a pure economic, and he showed the domino effect of, in their trucking industry, once he elaborated, it was probably a little bit bigger than I actually gave it credit for, and the number of people employed in that sector. And he goes, we can't just turn a switch and have multi-million people unemployed overnight. He goes, we just can't do that. No economy can sustain that. Yes, we want to work towards a greener future, but this isn't the way we will work towards it. It was just interesting to have someone actually come out and point that out.
So, but it's like we all want to transform the energy sector, okay? But actually the story is about transition. The story is about how do we transition. As you said, I think it's just to turn the tap off, so to speak, may not be the answer. So I think there'll be lots of ways we can transition, and I don't think it's just a direct line. And that is the difficult part. So a lot of the debate we have at the moment, the debates we're having is about transition and the speed of transition.
Yeah.
I don't think too many people are debating so much about our need to reduce CO2, but how do we do it in a quick manner, which doesn't bring our economy to the knees?
That's right.
And I think that's the great challenge we have. I think hydrogen is one of those solutions, and even within the hydrogen sector, there are debates about which, in terms of production, which is the best way of producing it.
Yeah.
My view is if it's a clean hydrogen, let's go ahead with it. There'll be learnings, we can move on, they'll get better anyway. And so I'd like to have those debates, which I think are important, but we've got to keep moving.
Yeah.
We have to be moving, we've got to be pragmatic and understand what our actual target is. It's a reduction of CO2, atmospheric CO2. Anyway, I think the government's so far doing a wonderful job in this area. They've been investing in this hydrogen for a long time, and you just don't hear about it a lot, but they have been.
Yeah, and there's quite a lot of what's the word for it? Advocates and ambassadors behind the scenes, and not so much behind the scenes. Most cabinets have some pretty pro alternative fuels, in there, and they're very approachable. It has the support. Like, that's the thing. It's if you've got the right business model to do it and take it to them, you'll get endorsed. And there is grant funding if you need to go down that path as well. It's not like that side of it. I don't see a big resistance. I think there's been enough. Like when I mentioned it, I remember in the 80s. Governments were talking about an energy crisis then. So we were all pretty well on top of that, and we all know, okay, change is imminent and it's here, and we're all expecting it now, including our decision makers and our legislators and our regulators. They're not sitting back, going, oh, how can we keep squashing this or holding this back? They are now embracing it. It's up to the industry leaders to present to them now. Here we go. Here's our innovative ideas. Here's this business model, or we want to take this to here. We want to go talk to someone over here in Europe, or whatever it needs to be, in Asia. Can you help us with that? And yeah, I don't really see that as there's no sort of blockage there anymore. The red tape has really lifted.
Yeah. That's our experience. So we've been the governments of Japan, the government of Australia, the government of Victoria, on our project at least, been very supportive. They've partially funded elements of our project as well. So, and this has been going on for years. It just doesn't get a lot of press about alternate energy sources. They don't want to sort of take bets, so they want to sort of share it out a bit to make sure that we're not putting everything into one bucket or into one opportunity or one technology, so to speak. So. No, I think just more needs to be done. I think, again, $11 billion by 2050 for our hydrogen exports, our hydrogen economy is big, but I just don't think that's going to be big enough to offset what potentially may occur with reductions in some of our other export. But I'm not the economist, but that's what I fear. So how can we do it quicker is what I keep on thinking of. How do we move more quickly?
Well, I see, and that's where a global focus, I think, helps too, when you target who the bigger emitters, where you can get that scale. Like when you go to China, like we're involved with a project with India and China, in particular, and I never knew this until a couple of years ago, how much carbon is used for concrete when the production of cement, cement not concrete, to make the powder, and how much they're emitting. So going to those big emitters will definitely start helping reduce, the overall figure, because they're emitting
everything
so
bit helps. Every bit helps. I think still electricity is about 35% of total emissions. I think transportation, I think, is about 16%. I think air travel is a few percent, 3 or 4%, and it's just in air travel. So I think just doing every bit, I think, helps.
Yep.
And I think, as I mentioned, the research on cement, trying to come up with different systems, and steel, there's a lot of work going on that area. But it's going to cost to change.
And it's hard, and people will naturally feel threatened when you say, oh, we're going to, the cement being such a big carbon emitter, we need to change that. They'll instantly go, well, there's millions of jobs there, millions and millions. It's like, oh, don't take our jobs or our industry. It's, no, we want to work with you. We still need you. Let's just try and let's collaborate and get some more. Let's get some alternate fuels going here.
Well, I think the cement industry in that instance doesn't disappear.
No.
It's just a different process to produce
right.
it. So I think in that instance, that's a relatively easy one. It was more the cost of building a new plant. So do you wait until the existing plant is at its use by date and then build a new one, which would seem sort of a logical approach, or do you, when an example, if a plant is halfway through its life, do you then end it then and build a new one? So I think that these are the questions which are more challenging, pose challenges for the financial people and businesses as well as others, their investors, as well as to when to do this transition. I go back to transition. Yep. The transition's a challenge. I do believe that technology will get there and will always improve. I think the transition of when do you adopt these new practices, I think, is more challenging for businesses and people. And even as a car manufacturer, so how many cars should Hyundai or Toyota, for example, be producing in terms of their fuel cell? I mean, what's the number?
Yeah.
Now, they don't want to overproduce and have not enough take-up. So they'll be sitting there asking the same questions, no doubt. And as a producer of hydrogen, how much should we be producing? We're looking for offtake agreements.
Yep.
So if we can sign an offtake agreement, that gives us a fair amount of certainty that that's what we need to produce per year for a certain number of years. And in actual fact, that's how the Northwest Shelf, so in Western Australia, the gas field started with the offtake agreements with Japan.
Yep.
In the late 70s, early 80s is when it started. Once you had the offtake agreements, then investors could come in with some degree of certainty and invest in building these facilities. So that's right. I expect from a hydrogen production viewpoint, that's probably going to be how that's going to kickstart. Then we can get investors to produce it, but who's going to have that? Who's going to sign that offtake agreement? They need certainty themselves that people will use it.
That's right.
All the way down their chain as well, whether it be yourself or vehicles or trains or industrial plants as well, or power stations. There's hydrogen-powered, hydrogen fuel power stations being developed at the moment. So there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes, but scale is what we're after.
Yeah, no, you're right. And that confidence comes if supplier agreements, and it's like a pre-sale. If you know that you can go to investors to say, well, we can make this a bigger beast. At the moment we're this, but we can supply, we've got these letters of intent. They're going to take up supply for the next 5, 10, 20 years. We may only work with 5 because it's such a changing space. 5-year letter of intent, they're going to take this up. We take that to the board of investors and they go, okay, it's like a pre-sale to them. Okay, and then they can work, they get their accountants in the room and they run some numbers and they go, yeah, this will make a nice little return here. So again, there's that, not too many want to take that leap of faith unless they see a commitment. Because they go, well, we don't know where this is going. You go, here you go. They've signed. They're looking to commit, and then when someone else does, then it's easy to take it to another interested body and say, look, these guys have committed. Do you want to commit? We can scale this, but if you commit, and they go, righto. And that's probably behind the scenes. That's where the BDMs and that come in, and you need the stakeholders to be, good at relationship building and being able to talk about it, not just at forgetting the science of it, but at a business level and convincing investors and stakeholders to jump in and say, righto, this is capital. We need capital. And we can do this, but we are in a capital market. And that's
going to be interesting. Once we get back to some degree of normality, I don't think it'll ever be exactly normal, but it'll be interesting to see what the capital markets are up to and what they want and what they need to be investing in.
Spot on.
So I think I would like to think they would be investing in obviously essential services, but I would say that energy is essential and clean energy is even more essential. So my hope is then this becomes the time. It really becomes the time, and bringing the country and the world together on a common platform of, say, hydrogen or clean energy, I think would be a wonderful thing. But time will tell.
Well, everyone's got time. They're all sitting at home now, bunkered away. They've got plenty of time to reflect. What we need to do is we need to force some power. We'll go around and start flicking everyone's power switches off, make them realise how vulnerable they are without a good energy supply. I'm being facetious, but
well, that's sort of in some ways that's accurate, because turning off the power is important because there's a demand, and so if we can reduce the demand of power consumption, with our energy mix at the moment, we can reduce the CO2 emissions. So reducing demand reduces the CO2. But what factors against that is the world's population growth. There's about 80, I read recently, 81 million people per year net are added to the world's population. So we've been talking, I think for an hour, that's 9,000, I think it's about 9,000 people an hour. Again, these numbers are significant, and so we have to power their life.
Yep.
So demand continues to go up. So again, I see these as opportunities. I do see these. I mean, we've got some immediate challenges, but I see these as an opportunity for a new industry, and I believe Australia can be at the forefront of that new industry as well. And I think that's the opportunity for us as a nation.
Yep. And efficiency is the key. I mean, everything we look in every part of our life, and how we do our businesses and how we conduct ourselves, and everything's about efficiency, and yet we look at how we actually fuel our lives. It's not that efficient, is it? So something like hydrogen as a fuel source there's efficiency right there, and so for me it is the next frontier. We're lacking to really take things to the next step when we're still relying on old principles. I mean. Combustion. It's actually incomplete combustion, rather than a very efficient fuel source. Like I said earlier, it fuels the sun. It's a source there ready for us to tap into and use, and it's clean, it's efficient, and for me, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, but the technology exists, more or less. It can get better always, but the technology exists. It's the take-up of hydrogen. So most of our effort will be in building awareness, allowing our population and the nation and the world to feel comfortable that there's good practices in place, good regulations are in place.
Yep.
They need to see it in real life, so hence these demonstration projects. There's a lot of pilot projects and demonstration projects going on around the world, not just in Australia.
Yeah, yep.
So there is, but you can somehow get caught into your own forest. You don't see the trees. So I'm thinking there's been great progress, but I often get brought back to reality when I go at a dinner party or something and catch up with people and don't know anything about hydrogen, and it's not their fault. It's just they don't know anything about it because you get caught up in a bit of a bubble. So everything we can do to find advocates, everything we can do to promote the benefits and why it will benefit everyone. So there's a lot of work to be done in that space.
Yeah, I was the same. If it comes up in my conversations, everyone just thinks it's all about safety, and they're thinking about nuclear power, so fusion, and they're thinking H bombs, and then you start talking about, well, they're different isotopes of hydrogen, and that's a much different conversation. That's not what we're talking about, and people just aren't aware of, when you talk about something like hydrogen as a fuel source. They're like, well, hang on, everything I've learnt back in high school chem, this thing could blow up and do all this and that. So it really is an awareness about, well, it's actually very safe, and
but they live every day with typically with petrol in the back of their vehicle. They've got gas pipelines and other chemicals are being stored, and hydrogen is being transported around Australia and the world as we speak. So but a lot of work needs to be going in this space, and I think the sooner we start, the better. And I think a lot of work, again, if you've got 20 countries already with a hydrogen strategy, one of their elements they'll be focused on is engagement, with their population, and that is ongoing. I don't think it's up to any one company to be responsible for that. I think, again, so the coalition of the willing, of coming together and collaborating. That's why there's a whole lot of industry associations being set up now, focused on hydrogen, but other associations such as energy are now bringing hydrogen as part of their platform. I think transportation sectors are now bringing hydrogen as part of their conversation. So it's happening. How long will it take? I'm not sure, but I only sense we just need to go faster because we have such a big challenge on our hands. That's all with the CO2 reduction or atmospheric CO2 reduction. It's a very dynamic sector. A lot of good people. Gee, there's a lot of smart people in this area already, and
it's pure science for me. I reckon.
There's science, but ultimately there becomes the economics of it, and all the wonderful people who can build these facilities and run the facilities. The people doing the research. Going back to your science part of it as well, but having a container which can store liquid hydrogen at minus 253 degrees centigrade, that's pretty awesome stuff, right? That's and it will forever get better. I mean, you've got to back them in.
Makes a good ice block in summer. Put in your HESC, and so there's another purpose.
Another purpose.
There's some uptake there.
Yeah.
Every slab of beer, you get a little canister of frozen hydrogen.
Jeez, it'd be liquid, but
liquid.
It evaporates so quickly, and that's the thing. It evaporates, goes into the air, and so very quickly. And that's actually in transporting the hydrogen. So we'll be shipping it from Melbourne to a port of Kobe in Japan. So if we can't keep it always at minus 253 degrees centigrade, so it vaporizes. So the aim is to be able to collect that and ultimately to use that vaporized hydrogen as the fuel, so we can start to fuel ships. So all these things about integration is really important as we develop the whole supply chain. And I think if people are looking around what to invest in and what will be a growing opportunity, I think hydrogen will be one of that, all the way down the supply chain.
So that's a whole other conversation too. I mean, pre this epidemic that we're in, there was already a sense of what's a safe asset or a normal asset base to invest in. That's kind of changed a little bit. When people start questioning how safe is actually money or cash, it starts bringing a few other questions into play, and things that are probably traditionally more risky type asset. This isn't financial advice. People are starting to look at them and go, well, hang on, that's not as risky now, when something that is at the bottom of our pyramid of safety is starting to move up a bit. Then this thing up here can probably move down here, and that's how we get these little. From an economic point of view, you've got to be careful about the bubbles that can arise, because people are thinking, we've got to find the next. We're changing the way we invest. Don't want to create a bubble and go, well, we're going to go with alternate fuels because we're a bit worried about this type of asset and that type of asset. So still, and that's where the financial advisors and economists they'll do their part and still try and lead with good financial advice. But at the end of the day, most people, in my experience, go with their gut and they invest with what makes sense to them and what feels right.
Well, I think, and that's where I think this suits, because there's good in it, okay, because of the reduction of CO2. I think if you take signals, if so many nations around the world are moving down this path, it's not just Japan or it's not just Australia. There's already 20, and others are starting their work on it. So, the question is, when do you want to jump in, and what is an area of interest to you? Is it making trucks like Nikola, or is it making vehicles like Toyota, or is it being involved in the production of it, or is it being involved in appliances? So, long term, the projection is we can run 100% hydrogen in our gas pipelines. We have to deal with some infrastructure issues, but it can be done. So the appliances will have to change.
Yep.
They can still be validated, but they can take up to 10% hydrogen in their gas supply without having to change your appliances at home. But if it goes above that, there may have to be a changeover. So this is where it's heading in the future. The question is, when is it going to happen?
Yeah.
And because I think it will happen. So if you're sitting there saying, well, I want to be involved in a really good investment on a very good cause, or a very good purpose, I should say, a very good purpose, then I think this is it. Then you can have the interest in what part of the supply chain you're interested in, and then you become another advocate, a very invested advocate to the hydrogen industry as well.
See, it's funny because it'll shift, and the way you're spot on, the way you're sort of presenting that. A lot of time we call them it's an emotional investment, which is quite there's that type of asset. You go, well, this isn't an emotional, and that's something more in the arts type, or philanthropy. Something that's for the greater good, and there's always a niche for that, and people will always go, well, this is for the greater good. This is an emotional investment, and that's how advisors would say to them, this gives you the feel good, and you've got 90% of everything over here. You're doing all this. You've got all your active assets. You've got a good life. You're doing this. Here's your feel good asset. But this will move from that.
Oh yeah.
Definitely. Like this
I think it already is.
This won't be. Yeah. This isn't this. Oh, this is the emotional investing now. This is. Hang on. Like the numbers you're saying, it's replacing a $50 billion
export market
industry.
Yeah.
It's big. This is where this is moving to. So it's actually going to become it's going to move from being the emotional investment into a financial.
Well, the pragmatism will come in, but just already the scale. So our project's $500 million. Yeah. So this is a pilot scale. So
there's big numbers
so
already.
The numbers are big, and the opportunity for Australia is to get out there first with export. We've got to find a way to start exporting before other countries. I was reading Russia. There was an article last night I was reading about Russia's move into the hydrogen export, because they sort of missed the game on the natural gas, LNG, their own internal machinations and so on. They sort of missed, but they're saying they do not want to miss the hydrogen. So they were already talking about 3 ways they want to produce hydrogen. So not 1 way, 3 ways. So there'll be excess nuclear power, hydropower, and steam methane reforming.
Yep.
And they believe they can get their pricing of hydrogen, which is strangely enough priced at per kilogram, but anyway, down to about $3. I think that's $3.38 per kilo by 2025.
Yep.
That's a very aggressive number. Good. I mean, if they can do it, I mean that changes the bar on all the other projects around the world. But so good for them if they can do that. It just means there'll be competition from Australia. We'll have to lift our game to be able to match or better that.
Yeah, it's always funny when I shouldn't say funny, but looking at how other countries under different types of regimes and how, because they can cost things differently, if they're a republic or more socialist. I mean, they value labour differently, hence why more capital markets or like Australia and America and most parts of Europe, where a lot of things are done offshore for that reason, because a higher cost to our type of economies are labour, whether it's skilled or unskilled. And yeah, it's always interesting to see other things that are in a growing industry or growing market, how the other regimes can come about a cost-effective model for their scalability. And it is always interesting. You've got to take a step back and go, well, okay, they can do it at this, and understand how and why.
But that is our competition, Mick. At the end of the day,
that's right.
if those numbers are correct, if those numbers, that's what we have to equal or better. And security of our supply chain, so the security of our supply chain, our reliability of our supply chain comes into question as well. It's likely that any off-taker will have multiple contracts with multiple sources, so they don't they decrease the risk profile of their supply of hydrogen. But this is the point. It's not a fear, but we just need to be careful as a country. We don't get caught up too much in our own internal debates. Pragmatism. Let's move as a nation. Let's have a go at this export industry, and we can continue, and also we can take it up locally as well, which would help, of course, as well. So that to me, if I had one fear, that would be that fear, that in actual fact, we've got to get on the table at the same time or before these other nations, and that's what we have in front of us. So hopefully we can come together and pursue that.
Yeah, spot on. Beautiful. Well, thanks for your time, Jeremy. Pleasure speaking with you and getting some further insight into the industry, and especially from your experience. And we'll continue these discussions and hopefully get some collaboration going, because I think that's what we need to do, and that's what I do. I get the right people like yourself and go, right, let's get these great minds, and let's collaborate, and let's get it moving, and let's support this industry. So thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Mick. It's been a pleasure. Very interesting.
Likewise.
So how do we shake in today's world?
Well, do we tap toes, or do we do a fake high five?
The elbow tap or something like that. What do you reckon?
We just do I grew up in the country, and we used to do that.
I can do that?
Yeah.
Huh?
There we go. Thanks for your time.
Mick. All the best. Cheers.
No worries.
Thanks.